Kia ora koutou, morena. Just a small clarification. In my presentation, you'll see I'm also market access for North Asia. So I have been director this year. New director and I changed roles 2 weeks ago, and funnily enough, she said that I could still speak at the conference. She didn't want to do it for me. Not quite sure why. So I've had a preset agenda. I've been asked what to cover in this talk. So my talk's just going to cover a little bit on the international context, the role of market access, which adding to what Brian has already said, overseas audits, and regulations in the Chinese experience. So just a little bit on the international frameworks which we work with. World Trade Organization is the global international organisation dealing with the rules of trades between nations. Sitting underneath this, the World Trade is what we call the SBS arrangement, and this requires governments to harmonise or base their countries' measures on international standards, guidelines and recommendations developed by the WTO and other international organisations. So the related international organisations covering animal health, plant health and human health for trade and primary products is Codex Alimentarius, the OIE and IPPC, which is International Plant Protection Convention. So Codex Alimentarius have a standard for honey. Governments will often run a test on honey imported into the country, a sugar test, and this confirms the husbandry practices will meet the Codex requirements for honey. And the Codex is quite a little neat definition for honey that the very first time I read it quite a few years ago, I was like, wow, that's really cool. So the definition for honey is the natural sweet substance produced by honeybees from the nectar of plants or from secretions of living parts of plants, which the bees collect, transform by combining with specific substances of their own, deposit and dehydrate, store and leave in the honeycomb to ripen and mature. So there are many aspects, the OIE is also another important body, international body. That's the World Organization for Animal Health. And for example, one of the areas where they're important is they have a chapter for American fowl brood, which has the requirements for trade in honey and hive products, etc., between countries. So there are many aspects to trade and rules for getting market access for your products overseas. So market access is key in maximising export opportunities via a range of functions. We're in a big time of quite a lot of global change. There's a huge pace in regulations that have been changed around the world. We've got a shift from our traditional markets to emerging economies. There's growing globalisation, and as we have trade agreements that bring down tariff barriers, there's a recognition, there's an increase in the number and the complexity and impact of non-tariff barriers to trade. These non-tariff barriers are often quite legitimate and justified. For example, New Zealand has food safety and biosecurity requirements to protect our plant and our animal health and our human health. We don't import our honey from very many countries at all. MPI spends a lot of its time navigating existing or new regulatory requirements that are claimed to address risks regarding public health and animal and plant health. What makes the season more challenging is a shift in our exports towards our emerging markets, whose governments are rapidly evolving their biosecurity and food safety regulatory systems. These countries have in the past, traditionally heavily relied on the testing of final products and are moving towards a more risk-based and supply integrity-based system. And while this is good for the long term, we often see regulations and standards that combine both the command and control type regulatory requirements with additional requirements including traceability and supply chain integrity. In addition, the scope of non-tariff barriers is expanding in response to consumer demands. Consumers are often demanding their governments to regulate more for quality and other factors, because consumers want to have confidence in what they are buying. So confidence is more about food safety, but also authenticity, especially when paying a premium. They want to be sure that what they are getting. Overseas, their consumers are often looking to their governments, and in turn those governments are often looking to the New Zealand government to provide an assurance. We're also seeing with the global trend that governments are starting to control health claims with regards to what can and cannot be made on labels. So that's no longer staying in the commercial arena. The market access teams and MPI, we undertake government-to-government negotiations for primary industry products, and these often result in export certification. We negotiate agreements which recognise New Zealand's production systems. So our ability to do a great job and influence overseas counterparts and improve trade conditions depends on them trusting our word. Our negotiations are science and risk-based, and we have to have a willing audience prepared to listen to us. We have to be upfront with what we don't know and what we do know. New Zealand has a world-class biosecurity system and food system, but the edge we gain in overseas markets comes from being credible, reliable, trustworthy, and with a good control on export. Recognition that trade is a two-way street is also important for success of market access. While some may bemoan at the complexity of international trading environment, we also recognise that New Zealand has a favourable position with great overall access. This comes from many years of hard-won negotiations, New Zealand's disease status, integrity and knowledge of officials, and the reputation of our domestic food safety and biosecurity regulatory systems, which all form the basis of our negotiations. I was asked in this speech to particularly talk about access to China, which I'll cover shortly, but this slide shows that if you combine mainland China with Hong Kong, although Brian said that there's a shift towards other markets, that Greater China is still an extremely important market for the exports of honey products. More than one trading partner in the past has expressed concerns about the amount of Manuka honey that's supposedly traded internationally versus the amount that's been produced in New Zealand. And this means that the concerns about the risks from our trading partners is not just about food safety, but they also relate to possible fraud, and therefore having a robust traceability system for New Zealand's honey is becoming increasingly important. I was also asked to cover just the international audits. So meat, dairy, seafood and plant industries are audited comparatively quite frequently compared to the honey industry. Audits can be of individual premises. These aren't our preferred ones, and with the amount of premises in the honey industry, that definitely wouldn't be the preferred approach. Most often, governments coming to audit us are doing a systems audit. So they're looking at how MPI regulates the entire and controls the entire production system. So from the farm or apiary through to providing an export certification. And in some contexts, they're also looking at the supply chains into their market, how the products are chilled, etc. Often the starting point for these foreign governments is how they regulate the product in their own country, and they're auditing on those bases and looking to find similarities and a good level of control. So the audits tend to range on a large range of regulatory functions, and traceability again is a key area to many foreign auditors. So the most recent audit in the bee industry has been from MPI's counterpart agency in China, AQSIQ. Probably a lot of people know that name in the room. They're the General Administration of Quality, Supervision, Inspection and Quarantine of the People's Republic of China. So specifically just talking about the China experience. So there's a very fast pace of regulatory change in China. China published its new food safety law in 2015, April of 2015, which came into effect in September 2015. So as with when New Zealand updated the Food Act, updating the primary legislation is just the very first step. And then there's a raft of additional legislation which gets developed underneath that. So some recent developments in China. So China's had the recent development of a natural honey GB standard. China's going through a process of requiring requirements for honey, so certification from every single country that exports honey to China. Each country exporting honey to China is required to undergo a risk assessment that covers food safety, diseases, traceability, regulatory standards and export controls. And this will lead to import requirements specific to each country exporting honey to China and certification to accompany all consignments, providing assurance from the exporting country's government that certain requirements have been met and that they have been verified. So this process is active currently. The other thing is the updated food safety law places greater responsibility on industry, including importers in China, to ensure that the food that they produce, distribute and sell is safe, suitable and meets the relevant Chinese guidelines. AQSIQ, for example, is now drafting guidelines for Chinese importers, explaining how they can demonstrate due diligence by auditing their foreign suppliers to ensure their production systems comply with Chinese requirements and meet all the relevant Chinese standards. So it has also been signalled that premises registration with CNCA, the Certification and Accreditation Authority, will be required at some point in the future. This is now the Chinese counterpart government authority. Registration for premises is already in place for our meat, dairy and seafood exports from New Zealand to China. Some of those have gone smoothly and easily, and some of those have been more challenging, and some ongoing challenges for some of those industries as well. Sorry, I missed that slide. So just in summary, we are living in a fast-paced, changing world. Overseas governments are seeking government-to-government assurances for a wide range of parameters, and often these are consumer-driven. And there's a continuing role of governments around the world for government regulation and to be able to show that we regulate well. Thank you. And I'll also be around on the stand up until lunchtime if there's any specific questions around market access. Thank you.